but for the time being, NATO has not wanted in this particular conflict to escalate vis-a-vis Russia. It's wanted to make this, as it is, a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, because Russia has invaded Ukraine, and not what Putin often claims it is, which is a sort of a war that NATO has instigated against Russia, an East-West clash. And obviously, NATO membership would mean NATO forces on Ukrainian territory, which at the moment NATO, of course, is avoiding, not wanting to be a direct party to the conflict. That's where, as I mentioned,
To Jamie Shea, former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General and an Associate Fellow at Chatham House, the international affairs think tank. Jamie, good morning.
good morning to you too.
As General Secretary General Stoltenberg said there, NATO has been supportive and indeed stood by Ukraine throughout this conflict. What difference would official membership make?
Well, what Ukraine wants is not, of course, only a lot of military support and equipment and tanks and air defense and all of that while it's fighting Russia in Ukraine at the moment, but it wants what it calls long-term security guarantees. In other words, a support from the West after the conflict, which means that it will be able to deter Russia and prevent Russia from attacking it in the future. And of course, from the point of view of Kiev and President Zelensky, the best form of that would be NATO membership, which would mean that NATO would extend its Article 5 security guarantee to Ukraine, like it has done in recent days to Finland. Finland has become the 31st member of NATO, and that would probably mean also NATO troops being permanently stationed on Ukrainian territory. So this is something which is looked very much for the long term, but Ukraine would want those security guarantees as a kind of precondition for being willing to go to the negotiating table with Russia later on.
Isn't the reality of this situation that NATO is actually scared of an alliance, of a membership like this with Ukraine, because of its, I suppose, the risk factor of being drawn into conflict? Which other NATO member states are at risk of active conflict that NATO would have to actually show some teeth on?
Well, NATO has consistently reiterated its promise to Ukraine that it will be a member of NATO one day. That promise was made back in a summit in Bucharest in 2008. It's been repeated many times. So NATO, despite Russia attacking Ukraine, has certainly not been intimidated and not backed down.
But they've not become members yet. Here we are in 2023.
Yes, but part of that is the membership of Finland and Sweden, which will be joining NATO soon too. So NATO has actually enlarged itself since Putin invaded Ukraine. So no, I don't think the West is intimidated. I simply think that there is a consensus, and that was evident in the meeting that was held in Ramstein yesterday of the NATO, the Ukraine support group, that today's focus is on providing Ukraine with those weapons, that military assistance, getting Ukraine through the conflict, first and foremost. And the NATO membership, the question of when, the roadmap, how Ukraine gets there, that's something for that second post-conflict phase that I was talking about a moment ago.
That's interesting. The German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius said it's not the right time for the NATO military alliance to decide on Ukraine's membership. Why is that, do you think? Why is there reluctance from Germany? And of course, that is reminiscent of 2008 when Angela Merkel was also reluctant for Ukraine to join NATO.
Yeah, no, I think that's obviously a very fair question. And it does show that, yes, indeed, inevitably in an alliance of 31 countries, there are nuances of opinion, and there are certain allies, for example, Poland and the Baltic states, that are more enthusiastic about an early Ukrainian membership of NATO than others, notably Germany or Hungary, which continues to have some bilateral issues with Ukraine. So NATO, of course, has to get to a consensus on that when. You're perfectly correct about that. But I do, coming back to what I said a moment ago, do think that what the German defense minister was saying reflects the general view that for the time being, the priority, particularly with Ukrainians announcing a spring offensive, is to give Ukraine the military wherewithal to push the Russians back very significantly. Because, of course, it's an obvious point to make, but Ukraine's membership of NATO depends upon Ukraine remaining a functional, viable state with territory, with access to its Black Sea ports, with a certain degree of security. Obviously, Ukraine conquered by Russia is not going to join NATO. So that has to be the immediate near-term objective.
That's quite interesting too, because that strikes me as quite a chicken and egg situation. Based on the response to this from Ukrainian officials, their sort of implication is, had Ukraine been a NATO member since 2008, or in this interim, then we would not be at this full-scale invasion stage by Russia.
Well, certainly when NATO made that a commitment to Ukraine back in 2008, Ukraine was not seeking NATO membership in the way it is doing at the moment. In fact, its constitution pledged it to neutrality, and it was only after Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014 that the Ukrainians changed that constitution and started moving towards NATO. So to some degree, NATO membership has been sort of provoked as much by what the Kremlin has done, by what NATO allies have decided to do. But for the time being, NATO has not wanted in this particular conflict to escalate vis-a-vis Russia. It's wanted to make this, as it is, a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, because Russia has invaded Ukraine, and not what Putin often claims it is, which is a sort of a war that NATO has instigated against Russia, an East-West clash. And obviously, NATO membership would mean NATO forces on Ukrainian territory, which at the moment NATO, of course, is avoiding, not wanting to be a direct party to the conflict. That's where, as I mentioned, NATO membership for Ukraine has to be in a second phase. But every country in Europe has the right to join an alliance if it so wishes. And that is a principle which, ironically, Russia has itself conceded in several European security documents going way back to the 1990s.